Hello and welcome to Doc Review with me, Camelia Shambayati. In this episode, we'll be reviewing The Coming War on China, directed by legendary documentarian John Pilger. Joining me in the studio today, we have Emerson Ford, who is a freelance film critic and film programmer based in London. He is also instrumental in programming the British Film Institute's monthly African Odysseys film, Strand. And beside him, we have Dan Glazebrook, who's a journalist, political analyst, and author of the book Divide and Ruin, the West's Imperial Strategy in an Age of Crisis, and is currently working on a new book called Supremacy Unraveling, Crumbling Western Dominance and the Slide to Fascism. Now, in The Coming War on China, Pilger lays bare the historical horrors of the US military in the Pacific, the dangerous build-up of US provocation in the region today, and boldly asserts that the US and China are on the road to war and even maybe nuclear war. Let's have a look at our first clip.
The world is being primed to regard China as a new enemy. The great power game is called perpetual war.
Our first president, George Washington, said, if you want peace, prepare for war.
Where are we going to stop this process before it starts a war?
The aim of this film is to break a silence, and nuclear war is no longer unthinkable. The equivalent of one Hiroshima bomb was exploded in these islands every day for 12 years.
They're not trying to run the world. They want to keep America from dominating.
We need an enemy for all this money, and China's the perfect enemy.
United States scientists conducted human radiation experiments to study how human beings absorb radiation.
There's really nothing more terrifying than this.
The Chinese, 2,000 years ago, built the Great Wall to keep the barbarians out, not to invade them.
As we look at China on the map, we can see that China is the basic cause of all of our troubles in Asia.
China, they want to dominate a huge chunk of the planet.
It is time to show the whole world that America is back.
I pity a country that would come up against us. We get better and better and better.
Well, thank you both for joining the show. Well, that documentary was incredibly thought-provoking and quite harrowing and gave unbelievable insight into the US's military aggression in the region. And it often felt like three films in one. Emerson, what were your first impressions of the film?
I must admit, it was shocking for me. I didn't know half the kind of revelations in the film. I mean, the history of the explosions in the Bikini Atoll and the kind of ongoing kind of crisis in the kind of communities there, the kind of long-term health implications of blowing up bombs every day for 12 years. And you just think that this goes on all the time, but you don't think about it, in a sense. You know, this is history, but you don't think that far back in history. And the other thing I liked about the film is the hidden history about America and China's relationship. Pilger talks about America's kind of introduction to China in the mid-1800s, and how America's history was one of anti-Chinese kind of Chinese racism, in a sense. You know, they were kind of unable to kind of live and work in America for almost 100 years. So it's a great film. Yeah.
What about you, Dan? What's your take on the film?
Yeah, I thought it was very good, and I think it's really timely. I think it's really important to be warning people, chatting from the rooftops really about the danger of, as Pilger says, a coming war with China. And I was glad to see it right at the end. He did include some quotes from Trump. You know, Trump has made no bones about his hostility towards China. He's saying that it's been raping America. You know, he wants to kind of rip up trade agreements and, you know, and so on and so forth. But this is really hostile, aggressive rhetoric. It didn't start with Trump. You know, the pivot to Asia they talk about in the film. 2009, I think it was, when Obama said we're going to relocate whatever 2/3 of the US military basically to the Asia-Pacific region to encircle China. So this has been going on for some time, but I think we are seeing a step change, gear change up in the aggression and the hostility with Trump, and I think it's It's particularly worrying as well. I think that we were talking earlier, Emerson and myself, about how there's not actually that much of the politics in the film, which is not necessarily a criticism. It was doing something else. What the film was doing was just bringing home the reality of what's happening, rather than necessarily explaining it and what's behind it. But it's interesting, you look at Trump's policy. He's being advised by Kissinger. Now, Kissinger was the architect of the policy to break away Russia and China in the 70s. And I think that's what Trump's trying to do now. He's seen in Syria that if you're trying to regime change against a country that Russia's got their back, that's very difficult. And so he wants to drive a wedge between Russia and Iran, between Russia and China, try and flatter Putin and woo Russia away from its alliances in order to be able to isolate and renew hostilities against Iran and China. So I think it's really important to be warning about this, and I think it does a good job of doing that.
So like you say, the film speaks for itself, and Emerson Pilger claims that this film is a warning. Do you agree with that?
I think it is. My problem with the film is, like I said earlier, is that I would have liked something more concrete as to why America has that strategy against China. Is it economic? Is it political? Is it why China? Why now? You know, and the good thing I think about the film as well is, like you said, is this isn't a Trump thing. This isn't from the right. This is started from Obama, this guy who came into power on the hope that it was going to be a new dawn in America. We were going to have this kind of new kind of look at how America sees its place in the world. But in a sense, he became, like every other American president, just doing the same policies. And that's why I like the film. I really did like the film. And the funny thing about Pilger is the fact that he looks like someone who would be, or his films would be quite dry and quite dense, but they're not. They're quite, what I find, revelatory type of thing. You know, if you don't know anything about the subject, which I didn't, you always feel that you're learning something, and it's not at the case of it's something dry and it's quite didactic and it's like telling you and preaching to you, you must know this type of thing. So it's a really good film in that aspect, yeah.
We'll take a break now from the discussion. Hopefully Dan can shed more light on the politics later on. And let's watch a clip now from the film in which Pilger asserts that war is on the horizon between the US and China.
The aim of this film is to break a silence. The United States and China may well be on a path to war, and nuclear war is no longer unthinkable. In a few years, China has become the world's second biggest economic power. The United States is the world's biggest military power, with bases and missiles and ships covering every continent, every ocean. China is a threat to this dominance, says Washington. But who is the threat? This film is about shifting power and great danger. It's also a film about the human spirit and the rise of an extraordinary resistance among people on the front line of a coming war, where the words "never again" have an urgent meaning for all of us.
Dan, so what do you make of Pilger's claim there that the US is already at war with China, the notion that nuclear war is no longer unthinkable? What do you make of that?
Yeah, I agree. I mean, if you look at the recent wars that the USA has been involved in, take Libya, for example. The war in Libya was, of course, it was aimed at Libya. Libya was an independent state that was helping to develop Africa. US, Britain, and so on didn't like that. But also, there's layers to these conflicts. There was also, the worry that these independent states, they might ally with China. They might ally with Russia and so on. So take them out before they do so. And a lot of these wars are about a part of the program to isolate China and isolate Russia by knocking out their strategic allies. So the breakup of Sudan that was initiated by the US. Sudan is a major oil supplier to China. So this is all all of these are part of a multifaceted war that, he's right, is already underway. Just because there's not a nuclear bomb dropped on Beijing doesn't mean they're not at war. And what's going on in the South China Sea is a major part of that. So of course our media always present, they will whitewash out of their presentation the US and British provocations towards whatever global South country they're trying to demonize. And then when there's a reaction, they'll say, look how aggressive these guys are. So that's what they're doing with China, as if China just out of nowhere decided to build these military bases for no reason in the South China Sea. In fact, as Pilger shows very clearly, they've been creating, as he calls it, a noose of bases around China for years. And China is worried, correctly worried, that the plan is to blockade China, cut off its lifeline of raw materials and so on. So this is very much a defensive strategy on the part of China, to keep open the sea lanes on which it depends. So this is some of the context. But this war to isolate China, yeah, it's already underway, and that's very important to understand, because he says, you know, China's not a threat. China is a threat to U.S. domination, not because it wants to be a rival, dominant global power. As Eric Lee said there, the Chinese guy who was talking to, China doesn't seek that, actually. But it is threatening the whole post-war imperialist system of plunder that's been elaborately worked out by the US and Britain and its allies. So, for example, I'll give you one example, the IMF in Africa. So basically, these African countries have been, you know, hammered by colonialism, forced into being dependent on one or two crops for export, totally usually in the past reliant on the US market and on Western financial institutions for loans, right, which they need. So what that put the IMF in a position of great power, particularly in the 80s and 90s when the Soviet Union was declining.
But to go back to the film, though, I mean, does Pilger show that China is perceived as a threat? What do you think, Emerson?
I think he does, but my problem with that argument, or his argument, is that I still feel that if you're the viewer, you'd like to know why the policy against China. Literally, if you look at the film, he clearly demonstrates that America have this...
But there's a growing sense of tension there, surrounding China.
There is, but the argument I would say is, if you're a viewer, and a casual viewer at that, if you haven't got the kind of specialist argument that you have, is that you'd want to know why America has this policy now. I mean, why did Obama in 2009 make this decision to go on this route? You know, and for me, that's the problem I had with the film, is the fact that I wanted to know more about that route. Why does America feel that China is a threat?
And surely I suppose that's a good mark of any film if it raises more questions and then it sets you off to go investigate yourself.
Exactly.
But let's just pause there for now as we take a look at our next clip where Pilger introduces us to the tragic history behind the Marshall Islands.
This is Bikini, the rim of an ancient underwater volcano in the Marshall Islands. With its necklace of 23 islands, Bikini is a place of beauty and silence and menace. Look closely where the Emerald Lagoon suddenly falls into a vast black hole. This is the crater of one of the greatest man-made explosions, the hydrogen bomb they call Bravo. It vaporized an entire island and poisoned almost everything and everyone. As our plane flew low, we seemed to touch its deathly void.
Some truly horrific revelations there. Emerson, for you, what was the most disturbing find from this film?
I think the most disturbing find is the fact that America has had kind of the authority over the Marshall Islands for the last, I guess, what, 70-odd years? Yeah, at least since they've been exploding bombs there, and they don't seem to be doing anything to alleviate the suffering of these people. I know it's an independent island, and in the movie, Pilger does say that literally there was a kind of agreement where they paid only $150 million for the best part of a decade long of actually exploding these bombs, and you think $150 million isn't a lot, even for I'm assuming a country with not that big a population. And
they ran out of compensation very quickly.
Yeah, and they ran out
didn't get any.
Exactly, and they ran out of compensation very quickly. I mean, it has to be said that that part of the film could be made into a longer film. I'd love to see a 90-minute film basically on that story, because it's a story that nobody knows. I don't think anybody would know about the Marshall Islands and about the whole destruction of their kind of communities. You know, the worst bit is when you see these people living in poverty. You know, these are people who were living quite happily before the Americans came, and did all this to their islands, and now they're living in abject poverty. I mean, literally, you see, there's a great piece in the film where you see this American base with lovely swimming pools and manicured golf lawns and water being put on golf lawns, and then he cuts it to where the actual community lives, on this rubbish heap, literally on a rubbish dump, you know, where it's got rusted kind of old mechanised tools and vehicles there, and you can see these people literally living on top of a rubbish dump, and you think to yourself, this can't be right, you know what I mean? America, and the funny thing is, America has the monies to actually pay to do, you know, to rectify the situation, and they just don't seem to do so. And
a lot of those people were living on the area that's now a US base that were thrown off to make way for these golf courses, and now are shipped over to go and service for low wages the golf courses and so on, and then shipped back to their rubbish heap to live.
Yeah, it's disgusting. It's amazing. It's like something out of the 19th century, and you think to yourself, well, why should this be?
Yeah. Well, Dan, why don't many people know about this? Why doesn't the mainstream media give much attention to this issue?
I think, do you know, I think there's so many parts of history like this. There's so many, and I mean, I consider myself probably a bit more knowledgeable than most on this stuff, but most of this was news to me. I'd heard of Bikini Atoll and the Marshall Islands and that there was testing, but I didn't know the detail. I didn't know that the US had shipped people back, knowing that it was still contaminated, deliberately so they could do tests on them and use them as human guinea pigs, and they all got radiation sickness and died and so on. Disgusting, I didn't know any of that, but there's so many. Every country nearly in the world will have some
hidden history.
Hidden history with you know, I remember reading in the Telegraph, I think not long ago, that I think 90% of the world's countries have been invaded by Britain. So they've all got their horror stories about British colonialism and so on. You know, how many bases are there? 1,000 US bases that there are around the world. They'll all have their horror stories of what's happened, the dispossession, the rapes, you know, the violence that's accompanied those bases. So, you know, I think there's just so much of it. And, you know, over here, we don't even learn the very basic facts about our own country's history of mayhem and colonialism in the world. We don't even learn the most basic stuff, let alone this kind of detail. So
it's such a shame. And let's just take another look now at our final clip from the documentary, which shows director John Pilger talking to some students about his film and the US's long history of violence.
According to one respected liberal commentator, Trump is, and I quote, unleashing the dark forces of violence in America. Unleashing dark forces? Really? Is he kidding? This is the country where toddlers shoot their mothers and the police wage a murderous war against black Americans. This is the country that has attacked and sought to overthrow more than 50 governments, many of them democracies, and bombed from Asia to the Middle East, causing the deaths of untold numbers of people. No country can equal this record of violence. It's systemic. And most of America's wars against defenseless countries have been launched not by Republican presidents, the Trumps, but by liberal Democrats, Truman, Kennedy, Johnson, Carter, Clinton, Obama. In 1947, a series of National Security Council directives described the paramount aim of American foreign policy as, and I quote, a world substantially made over in America's own image, unquote. The ideology was messianic Americanism. We were all Americans, or else.
Some very strong words there from Pilger. And Dan, would you agree with what he's saying, that the new president of the United States makes no difference to American foreign policy, that it consistently stays the same?
No, I think there is a difference. I think there is a ramping up. I think we are, as you mentioned the title of my next book, I think we're in a slide towards fascism, and I think that is qualitatively different and more violent than what we've had before. He's right that, you know, we can be angry at people who are hypocritical, who are now coming out against Trump, who were not opposing Obama's drone strikes, we're not opposing Obama's war in Libya, and so on and so forth. Fair enough to point out the hypocrisy. But if people are now starting to see the US for what it is because of Trump, we should welcome that and bring them on board, because Trump is, you know, a lot of people are deluded about Trump. A lot of people think that, oh, he's isolationist, he's going to withdraw from the Middle East. He's got now 2,000 troops announced are going to be in Syria. This is the ground invasion of Syria that everyone warned Hillary would do. Trump's doing it right now. And we still have people, and I think sometimes Pilger pushes the stick a bit too far the other way. I read the article he wrote about on the day of Trump's inauguration, I think, which is all kind of bashing Obama, which is all well and good, but Obama's finished now. It's Trump, and we need to be warning. And the ironic thing is, Trump is doing a good job of warning what's coming under Trump. But you know, we shouldn't use the fact that Obama and Hillary were warmongers to deceive ourselves that Trump is not. He is, and he's ramping things up, actually.
Emerson, so from that clip we watched, Pilger asks the question and discusses the question of Americanism, the notion that you're either with us or against us. What are your thoughts on that?
I must admit, it's something that I didn't know myself. I hadn't had thoughts about Americanism in that sense. But I guess, it is the kind of central tenet, I guess, of American foreign policy, isn't it? That literally you're either with us or you're against us. If you're against us, we'll do everything in our powers to make you become either our client state, or we're going to do everything to destroy you. So, yeah, I guess that is an argument that is quite true. One that I think, like myself, just a casual viewer of politics as such, I would think most people don't look at it that deeply, as Pilger put it there.
But based on the film, then, who is presented as the real threat? Is it the US or is it China, then?
Oh, I would say very much it's the US. I think China, in this respect, is like, it's just doing what any normal country would do. You know, it wants to defend its borders. It wants to it sees its country and its people as people who just want to get about their own life and about their own politics in their own region. Remember, America is thousands of miles away from the South China Seas. So why have all these bases around it? Yeah, and China only wants to do, you know, what anybody wants to do, make its people richer and have better living standards. And why would that be a threat to America? I can't understand it, but it's quite clear from watching this film that that is the case.
Is there anything you'd like to add?
Another thing that really comes across strongly is when we hear about increase in military spending and so on bases, we think of it in kind of a very abstract way. When he actually goes to the bases and you see them, and you see the people being thrown off their land to make way for the bases, and you see the primary school that had a US plane crash into it, you know, and boy scarred and charred and so on. You really understand what this means when to say there's 1,000 US bases around the place, and they're building a new base on Okinawa or whatever it is. And actually that puts in perspective, and with the Marshall Islands stuff as well, that does put somewhat in perspective that China's building an airstrip on an uninhabited island, and it's not firing missiles into it, you know, it's not polluting, it's not making it the most contaminated place on Earth like the Marshall Islands, it's not throwing off inhabitants because they're uninhabited. So it really does put these things in perspective, and when you say who is the aggressor, who's the threat from, it's absolutely clear in the documentary.
And Emerson, final 30 seconds to you. Do you think the film was successful then in delivering its message?
It was. It's a slow start, I must admit. Literally the first 20 minutes, or maybe 10, 15 minutes is about the Marshall Islands, which I didn't know anything about, but I did think once it got started, it's a really good film, yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm afraid that's all the time we have for today. And thank you to both my guests, and thank you for watching. Please make sure you follow us on Twitter and Facebook, where you can find us on @DocReviewShow. That's @DocReviewShow. Do let us know your views on today's film, and you can even suggest a documentary that you would like us to review. I've been Camelia Shambayati, and see you on the next episode of Doc Review.